My mother dropped her phone the moment the captain said my name. It struck the floor of the VIP shuttle, bounced once beneath her cream-colored seat, and disappeared from view. Even from the highest deck of the Ocean Crown, I saw her empty hand remain suspended in the air. The black shuttle was moving slowly along the secured lane beside Southampton's private cruise terminal. It was carrying invited industry guests towards a separate boarding entrance farther down the quay. My father sat beside her. My younger sister, Sophie, sat across the aisle in a white jacket I recognized from the photographs on Bennett Marine Interior's website. She had worn it for every interview about the ship's refurbishment. All three of them looked up. At me. At the flowers tied along the rail. At Daniel standing opposite me in a navy suit, one hand open between us as we prepared to exchange our vows. 6 weeks earlier, my parents had told me they could not attend my wedding because Sophie's preview voyage was too important to miss. They had made it sound as though they would be hundreds of miles away. Instead, they were close enough for me to see my mother's mouth form my name behind the glass. Captain Helen Ward stood beside the microphone, unaware of the shuttle below us. "Before we begin," she said, "I want to welcome Eleanor Bennett, the accessibility architect whose work helped thousands of passengers move through this ship with greater independence." A quiet wave of applause moved through our guests. My father's shoulders stiffened behind the shuttle window. Sophie turned away from me and looked towards the polished plaque near the gangway, the one listing the senior contributors to the ship's accessibility redesign. My body moved before my thoughts caught up. One foot shifted towards the staircase. For 20 years, that had been my reflex. Something was wrong, so I went to fix it. Someone was angry, so I went to explain. My family had arrived at the wrong entrance to my own wedding, and part of me still wanted to run down 3 decks to make their embarrassment easier. Daniel did not grab my arm. He did not call after the shuttle, or demand that anyone stop it. He simply looked at me. That was one of the reasons I loved him. He knew the difference between standing beside me and standing in front of me. The shuttle continued along the quay. I turned back to Captain Ward. "Please continue." 6 weeks earlier, my father had placed a yellow signature tab on my desk and told me that family credit was still credit. The folder landed beside my keyboard at 9:15 on a Monday morning. I had been reviewing a set of circulation diagrams for the Ocean Crown when the corner of the folder covered the route between the main lift lobby and the aft restaurant. "Friday," my father said. Graham Bennett never raised his voice at work. He did not need to. He had founded Bennett Marine Interiors 31 years earlier, and most people in the office still stopped speaking when he loosened his cufflinks. I looked at the row of yellow tabs protruding from the folder. "What am I signing?" "The final accessibility package." "For which vessel?" He gave me the expression he used whenever a specific question threatened to slow down a decision he had already made. "Ellie, you have worked here long enough not to require a guided tour through every sheet of paper." "I'm not asking for a guided tour. I'm asking for the final scope. The details are being consolidated. Then the package is not final." His jaw tightened slightly. That was all. To anyone passing the glass wall of my office, we would have looked like 2 senior colleagues discussing paperwork. No shouting, no threat, no obvious sign that one of us was my father and the other had spent 20 years waiting for him to put a promise into writing. "You know the standards," he said. "You know our process. Review the technical pages and sign where indicated." I pulled the folder closer, but did not open it. "I'll review every page before Friday." His gaze dropped to my hand. I had not said yes. I had not said no either. At 46, I was still fluent in the language between those 2 words. The office door opened before he could answer. Sophie entered wearing dark trousers, pointed heels, and an expression of polished urgency. "Dad, the hospitality team needs confirmation about the preview guest list." A bronze cabin key hung from a navy ribbon around her neck. It caught the light as she moved. Then I saw the engraved code. A 17 South Loop. My fingers went still against the folder. A 17 was not a cabin number. It was the internal code I had assigned to a wayfinding route 18 months earlier, during the first accessibility study for the Ocean Crown. The South Loop connected the gangway, lift bank, accessible cabins, medical center, and 2 primary dining spaces, without forcing passengers to cross the casino floor. The code had never appeared in public material. It lived in my technical files, workshop boards, and meeting notes. Sophie noticed me looking and lifted the key. "Nice, isn't it? The cruise team had them made for the lead guests." "What does South Loop refer to?" I asked. She glanced at the engraving. "It's part of the creative language for the passenger journey." "Which part?" "The southern section." "There is no southern section on a ship." My father exhaled through his nose. Sophie smiled as though I had corrected her pronunciation at dinner. "It's an internal concept, Ellie. Not everything needs to be reduced to engineering terminology." "I created that code." "You created a spreadsheet containing the code." "I created the route it identifies." My mother entered behind Sophie, carrying a stack of sample brochures. Margaret Bennett had no formal title at the company, but she approved the website, selected every publicity photograph, and knew which version of our family history to tell each client. She looked from me to the key. "Oh, good. You've seen it. Why is my project code on Sophie's preview pass?" "It's the company's project code," my father said. "It was created inside the company," I replied. "That doesn't explain why Sophie is wearing it." Mother placed the brochures on the table between us. "Because Sophie is representing the company at the preview." Her tone suggested this answered everything. I picked up one of the brochures. The cover showed Sophie, standing on the Ocean Crown's main staircase beneath the words, "A New Vision for Inclusive Luxury." My name did not appear. I turned to the second page. It described Sophie as the creative force behind the ship's redesigned passenger journey. My name still did not appear. "I'm attending the final walkthrough on Thursday," I said. "As technical support," Mother replied. "As the architect responsible for the accessibility design." She adjusted the edge of the brochure until it aligned with the table. "Clients respond better to a clear story." "Is the clear story that Sophie did my work?" Sophie let out a short laugh. "There it is." "What?" "The accusation." I wondered how long it would take. I asked a question. "You always ask questions in a way that makes everyone feel accused." My father tapped the folder beside my hand. "We are not doing this now. The preview is a major opportunity. Sophie needs the family behind her." The word family sat between us like a chair, with only 3 places. Mother lifted her phone and checked the calendar. "Speaking of dates, your father and I have decided to accompany Sophie for the preview weekend." I waited. She did not say anything else. "My wedding is that weekend." Mother's eyebrows rose with mild surprise, as if I had reminded her of a dentist appointment. "We thought it was a small registry ceremony." "It is a small harbor ceremony." "Exactly. Small does not mean optional." Sophie crossed her arms. "The cruise company chose the date, Ellie. I didn't. I chose my wedding date 8 months ago. And this opportunity arrived later. That's life." I looked at my parents. Their names were on the confirmed guest list. Their dietary preferences were recorded. My mother had asked whether pale blue counted as too close to white. My father had complained about the hotel rate, and then accepted the room Daniel and I had reserved for them. "The final security packet will be sent 2 weeks before the ceremony," I said. "It will contain the ship name, terminal, and boarding instructions." Mother waved one hand. "You don't need to rescind anything. We have made our decision." The ease of it hurt more than an argument would have. My father shifted his attention back to the folder. "If the next 2 vessel packages are completed on time, your project bonus can be considered during the next review." There it was. A door opened precisely far enough to keep me standing outside it. "And the partnership agreement?" I asked. Sophie looked towards the window. Mother began arranging the brochures again. My father remained still. For years, he had told me the same story in different forms. After the next contract, after the refinancing, after Sophie gained experience, after the market stabilized, after he had time to think about succession properly. "After this contract," he said, "we cannot divide the company before we know what Sophie can bring in." I had brought in regulatory approval, repeat clients, and 2 decades of completed projects. Sophie had brought in interviews. I opened my mouth to say it. Instead, my eyes dropped to the bronze key she had placed beside the brochures. It turned slowly on its ribbon. The reverse side faced upwards now. Beneath the code A17, 4 more words had been engraved. Lead designer preview guest. That evening, Daniel was chopping onions when my phone vibrated against the kitchen counter. I expected another wedding supplier. Instead, the message was from my Aunt Rose. Darling, I'm so sorry your mom and dad weren't included in the main guest arrangements. Families get complicated around weddings. I hope you won't let it spoil your day. I read it twice. Daniel stopped chopping. What happened? I handed him the phone. He read the message, set the knife down, and wiped his hands on a tea towel. We're not included? They are on the list. I know. They confirmed 8 months ago. I know that too. I opened the guest spreadsheet even though I did not need to. Graham, Bennett, Margaret Bennett, both marked confirmed. My phone rang. Mom? I answered on speaker. Hello? I've just spoken to Rose, she said. I hope you haven't upset her. I haven't spoken to her. She is worried there is tension. She thinks you weren't included in the wedding. A pause. Not a long one. Just long enough for me to hear the faint clicking of her bracelet against the phone. She must have misunderstood. What did you tell her? I said the arrangements were very limited. They are limited. You still have places. Eleanor, this is exactly why we should consider moving the ceremony. I stared at the onions on the chopping board. Moving it where? Not where. When? Our wedding is in 6 weeks. Sophie's preview could define the next decade of the company. My wedding is not a scheduling inconvenience. No one said that. You are asking me to change it. I am asking you not to force everyone to choose. The date existed before the preview. Sophie needs us. You have Daniel. Daniel's hand closed around the edge of the counter. It was a small movement, but I saw it. My mother continued. You have always been independent. That is one of your strengths. Sophie's path has been different. Different. It was the word my parents used when equal would have required too much effort. Sophie needed encouragement. I needed less sensitivity. Sophie needed opportunities. I needed patience. Sophie needed the family beside her. I had Daniel. I am not changing the date, I said. Mom Sahil. Then you have made your decision. No, you have. She ended the call. Daniel picked up my phone. For a second, I thought he meant to call her back. I put my hand over his. No. She lied to your aunt. I know. She is making it sound as though you excluded them. I know. Then let me. No. The word came out sharper than I intended. He placed the phone back on the counter. I took a breath. I don't want another man deciding how my family will be handled because he thinks I can't handle them. His expression changed. Not anger, not offense. Something quieter. You're right, he said. I had been prepared to defend myself. His agreement left me with nowhere to hide. He leaned against the counter. What do you need? I don't know. Then start with what can be proved. Daniel taught history at a secondary school. His study was filled with labeled archive boxes, reproduction maps, and folders containing copies of letters his students used for source analysis. He nodded towards my laptop. What is the earliest document showing what was agreed? The question settled something in me. Not emotionally. Structurally. I opened the wedding folder. Save the date. Sent 8 months earlier. RSVP confirmation. Received 3 days later. Hotel booking. Accepted. Mother's message asking whether pale blue was appropriate. Father's complaint about parking. I created a new directory. Wedding, family communications, source copies. Daniel brought me a packet of archive sleeves from his study. I usually mark the date received, sender, whether it's an original or copy, and what the document actually establishes. You make 16-year-olds do this? They complain less than your family. I laughed once. It surprised me. He did not sit down and begin sorting. He left the sleeves beside me and returned to the onions. I saved each email myself. Halfway through an old chain, I found a message Mother had accidentally forwarded to me 3 months earlier. The subject line read, "Remove technical names from client-facing deck." I opened it. The message was brief. Keep Eleanor's license details in the compliance pack. The client-facing version should be cleaner. Sophie needs to be the consistent face of the project. My hands went cold against the keyboard. I read it again. The client-facing version should be cleaner. Not simpler. Cleaner. As though my name were clutter. At 11 that night, I opened the marketing portfolio Sophie was scheduled to present during the preview. The first slide identified her as Design Vision Lead. The second showed an image of the redesigned gangway route. The third contained a paragraph from my accessibility report, changed only enough to replace technical terms with language about elegance and flow. My name appeared nowhere. I opened the regulatory submission for the same project. There I was. Eleanor Bennett, Lead Accessibility Architect. My registration number sat beneath it. My scope of responsibility filled half a page. Marketing said Sophie had created the transformation. Compliance said I would answer for it. I checked the file properties. The presentation had been exported from a document I created 14 months earlier. The author field had later been changed to Margaret Bennett. A rehearsal video sat in the same project folder. Sophie stood in the company's presentation room, speaking towards an empty row of chairs. I redesigned passenger movement from the gangway inward, she said confidently. I paused the video. That route had not begun with a sketch on Sophie's mood board. It had begun with Nadia Rahman telling me that luxury meant nothing if she had to ask a stranger to move a decorative table every time she wanted to enter a restaurant. 3 rounds of interviews followed. Then route testing. Then drawings. Then arguments over every centimeter removed for appearance. Sophie had attended the final presentation. She had not attended the work. I drafted an email to my father. I kept it factual. I requested the final scope for both new vessels. I requested corrected attribution. I requested suspension of any language implying Sophie held technical responsibility. I requested written confirmation that my license details had not been attached to work. I had not reviewed. His response arrived 14 minutes later. Do not confuse authorship with company ownership. I opened my employment contract. Most work produced within my assigned duties belonged to Bennett Marine Interiors. I knew that. I had never claimed the company could not use the drawings. But copyright ownership was not the same as professional approval. It did not allow anyone to attach my registration number to a vessel I had never inspected. I returned to the folder my father had placed on my desk. The final 2 tabs marked documents for vessels called Crown Meridian and Crown Celeste. I had never stepped aboard either of them. Yet one already had a client portal code linked to my professional registration. On Thursday, I joined the final walkthrough aboard the Ocean Crown. Nadia Rahman was waiting near the aft restaurant in her wheelchair, speaking to Oliver Grant from the cruise company's compliance team. Sophie stood beside them in her white jacket. We're nearly finished, she said as I approached. Just a few aesthetic checks. Nadia rolled towards the restaurant entrance. A new marble-top display counter stood beside the doorway, covered with decorative glassware. She slowed, turned, stopped. The front caster of her chair came within an inch of the counter. This wasn't here last time, she said. Sophie touched the marble edge. It was added to soften the entrance. The corridor looked empty. It reduces the turning radius, I said. It's decorative. It is still occupying physical space. I took out my laser measure. The clear width was below the approved drawing. I checked the revision sheet. No authorization. No reinspection. Oliver looked at Sophie. Who approved this? Our design team, she said. Nadia turned towards me. Was it in the drawing you approved? No. One word. For years, I had padded answers with explanations to make them less uncomfortable. This time, I let the words stand. I recorded the measurement, photographed the location through the authorized inspection app, and marked the item for removal pending review. Sophie moved closer. Ellie, we are hosting people here next week. Then it needs to be corrected before next week. You are making a display counter sound like an emergency. I am documenting an unapproved obstruction. Nadia's hand rested on the wheel rim. I would prefer not to become the obstruction, she said. Sophie looked away. After the walkthrough, Nadia waited while Oliver took a call. I assumed your name was on the public material, she said. It isn't. You led every user session I attended. I know. Do you need me to say that somewhere? The offer loosened something in my chest, but I did not seize it. If it becomes necessary, Would you be willing to confirm only what you directly witnessed? Yes, provided my experience isn't used to turn a professional dispute into a public family spectacle. That is not what I want. Good. She studied me for a moment. I've met people who want accessibility as a slogan. You treated it as a responsibility. Don't let anyone reverse those two things. Before leaving the ship, I issued a written inspection note. All changes after this date require renewed written approval. Silence does not constitute consent. Oliver read it, then glanced at the glossy brochure Sophie had left on a nearby table. May I ask you something? Yes. Why does the bout architect behind the transformation? The following morning, my father summoned us to the conference room. Mother sat at the far end of the table with a printed copy of my email. Sophie had the brochure in front of her. My father began as though opening a routine project meeting. We need to clear up several misunderstandings. I agree. Marketing language is not a regulatory declaration. No, but it cannot misrepresent who performed the work while using my license in the regulatory declaration. You are being excessively literal. I am an architect. Literal details are part of the job. Sophie folded her arms. If you continue dissecting every phrase, there won't be a contract left to sign. Then the phrases should survive scrutiny. Mother pressed her fingertips together. We are missing your wedding to support a future that benefits everyone. The least you could do is stop treating Sophie like an intruder in her own company. I have no shares in this company, I said. Neither does she. Father's eyes sharpened. That is irrelevant. It becomes relevant every time you use the word family to avoid discussing ownership. I opened the sign-off package. I signed the completed sections of the Ocean Crown refurbishment, the areas I had inspected, measured, and approved. Then I reached the final 2 vessel packages. I drew a line through each signature box. Beside them, I wrote, "Not reviewed. No professional authorization granted." My hand trembled slightly on the final word. I dated it, scanned it, saved a copy to my source archive. Father watched every movement. Are you genuinely prepared to put 23 jobs behind your professional ego? I am putting responsibility before an unauthorized signature. His face remained controlled. That made the silence worse. Sophie pushed her chair back. You have always needed everyone to know you are the clever one. No, I said. I need clients to know who is responsible when something goes wrong. Mother gathered her papers. You will regret turning your wedding into a line in the sand. I looked at her. I didn't choose the line. For the first time, I did not add an explanation. That night, Daniel and I were reviewing the seating plan when an automated email appeared on my screen. Welcome to the Crown Fleet Client Portal. I opened it. 2 new projects had been added to my account. Crown Meridian, Crown Celeste. My listed role was Lead Accessibility Consultant. I checked the access log. The account had been created 3 days before the conference room meeting. 3 days before I had crossed out the signature boxes. 3 days before my father had pretended he was merely asking me to review them. Someone had already promised my name to 2 ships I had never stepped aboard. Part 2. The signature they thought they owned. By 5 the next morning, the dining table had disappeared beneath paper. Not company paper. Not yet. Only documents I had a lawful reason to possess. Emails addressed to me, copies of my employment contract, project files assigned to my account, inspection notes I had authored, and access logs from the client portal that carried my professional registration. The automated welcome message remained open on my laptop. Lead Accessibility Consultant, Crown Meridian, and Crown Celeste. Someone had created the account 3 days before my father placed the signature package on my desk. That fact sat at the top of the page Daniel had helped me tape to the wall. He had brought the small scanner down from his study, but had not touched any of the files. Instead, he ran the power cable beneath the table and placed a stack of blank archive labels beside my elbow. Originals on the left, he said. Working copies on the right. You say that as if I'm one of your students. My students usually listen before 4 in the morning. It's after 5. That explains the improvement. The joke earned half a smile from me. A legal pad lay open beside the keyboard. Across the top, I had drawn 5 columns. Date. Document. Sender. Version. What it proved. Not what I believed it meant. Not what I feared my father had intended. Only what the record could establish. The distinction mattered. Suspicion had brought me to the table. It would not be enough to protect my license. The first line contained the original Ocean Crown project instruction. The second identified the approved accessibility scope. The third recorded the day my A17 route appeared in the internal design package. Farther down, I added the marketing deck, the regulatory submission, and the 2 crossed-out signature pages. Daniel returned from the kitchen with coffee and stopped behind my chair. "You're assigning document numbers?" "Yes." "Good." That sounded dangerously like approval. It was admiration. Teachers are allowed that. He set the mug beside me, careful not to place it over a page. A separate folder held the files that needed closer examination. Most of the drawings created during my assigned duties belonged to Bennett Marine Interiors. My employment contract was clear about that. Being the author of a drawing did not automatically make me the copyright owner once it had been produced as part of my job. My father knew that. So did I. The problem was not that the company wanted to use work it had paid me to produce. The problem was that Graham kept treating copyright, professional approval, authorship, and personal registration as though they were 4 names for the same thing. They were not. A company could own a drawing. It could not make me responsible for a later revision I had never reviewed. It could own a report written during my employment. It could not attach my registration number to a vessel I had never inspected and call that ownership. Several files in the proposed package created another problem. The passenger interview framework had begun as a method I developed before the 2 new vessel projects existed. The reusable testing templates had no project code. Some of the route concepts appeared in my notebooks months before the company received instructions for the new ships. That did not prove they belonged entirely to me. It did prove the position was not as clean as Graham's email suggested. I opened the project portal profile. The public-facing field described me as a technical consultant. A restricted responsibility field identified me as the responsible accessibility architect. On one screen, my role had been minimized. On another, my liability had been maximized. The account creation log showed Graham Bennett under approved by. My fingers paused over the keyboard. The date beside his name was the same day my mother had called to ask whether Daniel and I could move the wedding. Not the same week. The same day. At 10:14 that morning, Margaret had told me Sophie's preview could determine the future of the company. At 4:36 that afternoon, Graham had approved a portal account, assigning me responsibility for 2 ships without contacting me. The wedding had not created the conflict. It had created a useful gap in my availability. I entered the date into the timeline. Daniel leaned over only far enough to read the heading, not the entries. "Do you want me to make a backup?" "Yes, an encrypted copy of the archive folder only. Don't open anything." He nodded. No wounded expression. No reminder that we were getting married in less than 6 weeks. No attempt to prove his usefulness by taking control. He inserted the drive and waited for me to select the files. Before going to work, I called the insurance broker from my personal phone. The woman who answered introduced herself as Claire Dunning. I gave her my name, my registration details, and only the information necessary to ask for preliminary estimates. "I'm currently covered through my employer's professional indemnity policy," I said. "I may leave, and there is a dispute over whether my credentials have been associated with work outside my approved scope." Her tone became more deliberate. "Are you asking about cover for new independent work or historic exposure?" "Both. They would need to be considered separately." That was the answer I expected, but hearing it tightened the muscles between my shoulders. Claire explained that a new policy could address future independent work, subject to underwriting. Historic claims were more complicated. Much would depend on the company's existing policy, the wording in effect when the work was performed, continuity of cover, and whether the employer accepted that the disputed work had been done within the course of employment. "What if the company refuses to provide anything beyond the standard wording?" I asked. "Then, you would want written confirmation of what the existing policy responds to. If there is uncertainty around specific revisions, a future insurer may price that uncertainty." "How heavily?" I can't answer without documents. Can you give me a preliminary range? She did. The lower figure consumed most of the completion bonus my father kept mentioning. The upper figure consumed the bonus and a substantial portion of the savings Daniel and I had planned to preserve after the wedding. No dramatic collapse followed. The ceiling did not shift. The room stayed exactly as it had been. That made the number more frightening. I thanked her, requested the estimate in writing, and opened a new spreadsheet. 9 months of basic household costs. Insurance, professional registration, accounting, equipment, office deposit if I eventually worked independently. The total looked less like freedom than a cliff measured in pounds. Still, it was measurable. Things that could be measured could be prepared for. Before leaving the table, I transferred part of my savings into a separate reserve account. The amount made my stomach tighten. It had taken years to build, and moving it felt like admitting I might never receive the partnership my father had promised. The transfer confirmation appeared on screen. For the first time, I had put money behind the possibility of leaving. That choice changed the timeline more than any document on the wall. Aunt Rose hosted lunch the following Sunday. Her house smelled of roast chicken and furniture polish, 2 scents I had associated with family gatherings since childhood. The same framed photographs still lined the hallway. Sophie at her university graduation. Sophie at a company awards dinner. Sophie holding a ceremonial pair of scissors beside my father at an office expansion. One photograph showed me. I stood at the far edge of the frame, half behind a floral arrangement, holding the project folder everyone else had arrived to celebrate. Daniel's hand brushed mine as we entered the dining room. He did not squeeze it until I looked at him. "Do you need anything?" he asked quietly. "Not yet." Mother was already seated beside Aunt Rose. Father occupied the chair at the head of the table, although the house was not his. Sophie sat opposite him, scrolling through images from a preview rehearsal. 2 other aunts and a cousin filled the remaining places. Rose kissed my cheek, then held my shoulders and studied me. "You look tired, darling. I've had a busy week." Her eyes shifted briefly toward my mother. "I suppose anyone would, with wedding arrangements becoming so complicated." The phrase sounded rehearsed. I set my napkin across my lap. "What has become complicated?" Rose hesitated. Mother reached for the water pitcher. "There is no need to discuss it over lunch." Rose frowned. "I only meant that I'm sorry you couldn't include your parents on the ship." The serving spoon struck the side of the vegetable dish with a small metallic sound. No one moved. Across the table, Sophie placed her phone face down. "My parents are included," I said. Mother poured water into her glass. "Eleanor, they confirmed their places 8 months ago." Rose looked from me to Margaret. "You said they weren't part of the onboard arrangements." "I said the event was extremely limited," Mother replied. "I didn't want anyone to feel pressured. Their names are on the manifest." Father's chair creaked as he leaned back. "This is neither the time nor the place." I didn't introduce the subject. "You are embarrassing your mother." "I'm correcting information about my wedding." Aunt Rose put down her fork. Mother folded her napkin once, then again. "We understood that our presence might distract from the intimate event Eleanor wanted." "That isn't true." Her lips compressed. Sophie gave a breathless laugh. "This is exactly what I mean. Every conversation has to become an accusation." "Who told Aunt Rose that Mum and Dad weren't included?" "No one used those exact words," Sophie said. Rose reached for her phone. "Margaret did." Mother turned toward her. "Rose, there is no need to start showing private messages." "I don't like being told I imagined something." She unlocked the screen and passed the phone to me. The message read, "We were advised our presence might distract from the kind of wedding Eleanor wants. We are trying to respect her wishes, even though it hurts." My thumb remained above the screen without touching it. There was nothing accidental in the wording. It did not state that I had disinvited them. It only invited the reader to reach that conclusion. Mother had not created a lie that could be easily disproved. She had created a wound and left my name beside it. "I never advised this," I said. Mother's voice lowered. "I was trying to preserve everyone's dignity. By telling people I didn't want you there?" "I did not say that. You made sure Rose would think it." Father placed his palm flat on the table. That is enough. The old reflex rose before I could stop it. Apologize for the tension, change the subject, let everyone eat. My mouth even opened. Then I looked at Rose's phone and remembered the email folder at home. There were documents for what had happened. There were also documents for what I had agreed to. I did not need to win the table. Mum, from now on, do not explain my wedding arrangements to anyone on my behalf. Her eyes widened. I am your mother. That does not make you my spokesperson. One of my aunts shifted beside the window. Surely this is too much over a misunderstanding, she said. Your sister has a major business opportunity. Weddings are one day. So is a contract signing, I replied. That doesn't make consent optional. Sophie pushed her plate away. You're punishing me because the company finally recognizes what I bring. I have not asked you to give up the preview. You don't have to. You're making everyone feel guilty for attending. I'm asking people to tell the truth about why they chose it. Father stood. The movement ended the meal more effectively than shouting would have. We will discuss the company at the office. This is about my wedding. Everything has become about your wedding. No, everything has become inconvenient because I won't move it. Daniel remained seated until I rose. He thanked Aunt Rose for lunch. Nothing more. Outside, the afternoon air carried the smell of rain from the harbor. Rose followed us to the front step. I'm sorry, she said. For asking? For believing the message without asking you. That apology felt different from the ones my family usually offered. It named an action. It did not ask me to comfort her. Thank you, I said. In the car, Daniel opened the wedding confirmation system on his phone. I had given him access months earlier because he was handling hotel coordination. Your father's confirmation has an activity record, he said. I turned toward him. What does it show? He opened the email. Did he open the security document? Daniel enlarged the screen. No attachment activity. The timestamp sat beneath Graham's name. He had received the message. He had opened it. He had not bothered to open the file that contained the ship name and terminal information. They had not been denied the location. They had decided it did not matter enough to read. 2 days later, Daniel and I attended the menu tasting at a small restaurant overlooking the marina. The owner placed 3 miniature desserts between us and left us to choose. Daniel had barely touched the lemon tart. What? I asked. He looked through the window toward the masts. I wrote an email to your father. The fork stopped halfway to my plate. Did you send it? No. Why did you write it? Because he is threatening your career and rewriting your wedding, and watching you absorb it is becoming difficult. Watching me? That came out wrong. It came out honestly. He folded his hands on the table. The email is in my drafts. You can read it. I won't send it. Why didn't you tell me? Because I knew you would say it wasn't my decision. It isn't. I know. Do you? The question came out harder than I intended, but I did not take it back. Daniel looked at me directly. Yes, knowing something doesn't always make the impulse disappear. Beyond the window, a gull landed on the railing and shook water from its wings. For most of my life, other people had treated intervention as proof of love. Father solved a problem by taking over. Mother protected someone by changing the story. Sophie accepted help and later called it collaboration. Daniel had stopped before acting. That mattered. It did not erase the boundary. I need you to stand beside me long enough for me to move first, I said. His face tightened slightly, but he nodded. Then tell me the rules. No contacting my parents or the company unless I ask. Agreed. No sending documents, even if you think they prove my case. Agreed. If I give you a backup, you store it. You don't use it. Agreed. In return, I won't hide decisions that could affect our finances. His shoulders lowered. That one matters. I know. He glanced at the harbor. Should we move the wedding? The suggestion hurt, though his voice carried no pressure. Why? So that the ship isn't tied to the dispute. The Ocean Crown rose beyond the marina buildings, its upper decks visible above the terminal roofs. My father had tried to turn the ship into evidence of Sophie's talent. My mother had reduced my ceremony to a small administrative event because taking it seriously would have required choosing me. Neither fact changed what the vessel meant to me. Nadia's turning route was there. The lowered information desks were there. The revised cabin thresholds were there. Work I had done with care was there. No, I said. We're keeping it. Daniel waited. The ship doesn't belong to them, I continued. And I won't surrender every place they contaminate. He picked up the lemon tart. Then we keep the ship. Back home, another line on the timeline caught my attention. The portal account had been approved less than 6 hours after Mother's call asking me to move the ceremony. That sequence did not prove they had coordinated the dates to trap me. It did prove my absence had been useful before I even refused to sign. Graham's next meeting invitation arrived the following morning. The subject read, Resolution Proposal. Mother and Sophie were already in the conference room when I entered. A document rested at my place. Father did not ask whether I wanted coffee. I have created a path forward, he said. The first page offered me 5% of the profit from the 2 proposed vessel contracts, payable only after completion and subject to final project performance. 5% sounded generous until I read what followed. Sophie would retain the public title of design lead. I would provide technical review and sign-off. Every listed concept, associated method, pre-existing template, and research framework used in the pitch would be assigned to Bennett Marine Interiors retroactively. A separate clause required me to confirm that all of it had been created in the ordinary course of my employment, including items produced before the company issued project instructions for the 2 vessels. The final pages contained a non-disparagement clause broad enough to prevent me from saying the previous attribution had been inaccurate. Father watched me read. This is the recognition you've been demanding. I asked for accurate attribution. You're receiving a profit share, conditional on me accepting Sophie as public lead and assuming technical responsibility. You would be doing the work you have always done. That is the problem. Mother leaned forward. The agreement protects everyone. It protects the company's claim to material that may not fall within my ordinary assigned duties. Father's expression did not change. The company owns work created by its employees. Much of it, yes. The answer seemed to surprise him more than an argument would have. I tapped the assignment clause. If ownership is already beyond dispute, why do you need me to transfer pre-existing templates and associated methods retroactively? Lawyers prefer clean records. Then the records are not clean. Sophie's gaze moved from the agreement to Father. Could I be held responsible for what I present? He did not look at her. Ellie handles the technical responsibility. Sophie sat back. There it was. Not in a secret recording. Not in a message sent to the wrong person. Spoken across the same table where the company had spent years describing us as equals with different strengths. Sophie would tell the story. I would answer for the consequences. Graham would own both. The promised succession had never required him to choose between us. Keeping us incomplete was the mechanism. I closed the agreement. I'm not signing this. Mother's hand tightened around her pen. You haven't even discussed amendments. I will not amend a document whose basic purpose is to legitimize the arrangement I objected to. Father's voice became quieter. Then your completion bonus will not be approved. The number Claire had quoted me flashed through my mind. He continued. The partnership discussion is over. It was never a document. It was based on trust. So is professional approval. His eyes narrowed. If you leave while creating a dispute over historic projects, the company will not finance a separate runoff arrangement for you. We will rely on standard policy terms. Nothing more. You cannot erase existing cover by saying that. I did not say we would. The precision was intentional. He was not claiming the old policy vanished. He was reminding me how expensive uncertainty could become. There will be no expanded indemnity, he said. If you want an independent practice, you can purchase your own protection and defend your own position. Mother spoke softly. Why would you risk everything you have built over a title? I placed my copy of the agreement inside my folder. It is not the title. It is the gap between the title and the liability. Father stood as I reached the door. You cannot withdraw what the company has already sold. The sentence followed me down the corridor. At home, I forwarded the agreement to my personal archive and called Claire again. She asked for the relevant policy wording, my employment contract, and a factual description of the disputed scope. No accusation. No theories. Only records. Her preliminary estimate arrived later that afternoon. The cost of new professional indemnity and additional protection around the historic uncertainty was almost exactly equal to the bonus my father had withdrawn. I transferred more money into the reserve account. The balance in my ordinary savings fell low enough to make the wedding expenses look irresponsible. For 10 minutes, I sat with the venue invoice open and considered canceling the flowers, reducing the meal, or postponing the ceremony. Then another thought arrived. That was how the system survived. Every consequence of their choices became a reduction in my life. I closed the invoice and opened a blank document. The notice took less than 1 page. It identified the work I had reviewed. It listed the vessels and revisions I had not reviewed. It stated that my registration number, professional biography, approval stamp, and signature block could not be used for unapproved scope. It requested an independent review if the client wished to maintain the project schedule. No allegation of fraud. No demand that the contract be canceled. No mention of my wedding. At 9 the next morning, I sent it to Graham and allowed 4 hours for written confirmation that the portal assignments would be corrected. 40 minutes later, my company email stopped accepting my password. The screen displayed, "Access restricted. Contact administrator." My pulse beat hard in my fingertips. The client portal remained accessible because the registration was linked to my personal professional identity. At the end of 4 hours, no correction had arrived. I uploaded the notice through the compliance channel. Oliver called 11 minutes later. "I've received your statement," he said. "Thank you. I need to be clear. This does not suspend the full project. I'm not requesting that. The accessibility approval package will be paused pending clarification. The remaining commercial process may continue if it can be separated. That is appropriate. We will open an independent review. Please preserve all files and logs in their current form." "They are preserved." He paused. "Did anyone instruct you to issue this notice?" "No." "Is anyone speaking for you?" "No." "Understood." After the call, Nadia emailed a statement limited to the meetings she had attended. She confirmed that I had led the user research, reviewed route testing, and issued the accessibility changes she witnessed. Nothing about my father. Nothing about Sophie's motives. Nothing beyond her own experience. I thanked her and stored the original. Claire's reply arrived next. She confirmed that historic work properly performed during my employment would ordinarily be considered under the employer's policy wording, subject to the actual terms and circumstances. The disputed later revisions needed to be separated clearly. That made my next decision easier. A new savings account opened under my name alone. I transferred the reserve. Not settlement money. Not Daniel's money. Money I had already earned and was now choosing to spend on the right to leave. Then Graham's letter arrived. My completion bonus would not be submitted for approval. Bennett Marine Interiors would rely solely on standard policy terms and would not fund any separate runoff arrangement or additional indemnity if I left during an active dispute. The letter ended with one line. "Your current position remains available if you resume your assigned duties immediately." The door was still open. Only if I crawled through it. My salary arrived on its usual date. The amount was correct. That small legality did not soften what followed. My profile disappeared from the company website. Meeting invitations vanished from my calendar. The broker's formal estimate exceeded the preliminary figure because the disputed historic scope required additional review. A third of my accessible savings moved into reserve before I had a single independent client. Then Mother's messages began. "Rose is extremely upset by the way you behaved. Your father is trying to protect the employees. Sophie has worked too hard for you to destroy this opportunity." A cousin sent me a screenshot from the extended family group. Mother had written that I had abandoned the company just before its largest contract because I could not tolerate Sophie finally being recognized. I did not enter the group and defend myself. The notice was already doing work that an argument could not. 3 days later, Sophie posted a preview video. She stood beneath the Ocean Crown's central chandelier and smiled into the camera. As the designer who reimagined the passenger journey, I wanted every guest to feel that movement through the ship was effortless. The route diagram behind her was mine. The language was mother's. The responsibility field in the client portal still carried my name. My phone rang before the video ended. Leah Morgan worked in the technical team and had joined the company 2 years earlier. She was competent, cautious, and usually too afraid of Graham to call anyone without scheduling it first. "Ellie," she said, "I'm sorry. I didn't know whether I should contact you. You're contacting me now." They're redirecting accessibility questions to Sophie. "What kind of questions?" "Clearances, route sequencing, cabin thresholds. She keeps telling us to use the previous vessel as the model. The vessels do not have identical layouts." "I know." Her breath caught. "People are saying the package will fail because you walked out." "I did not walk out. My access was restricted after I issued a scope notice." "Can you come back until the contract is signed?" The request reached the exact part of me my father had relied on. Leah had not taken my name from a slide. The junior team had not created the portal assignment. If the project stalled, they would carry anxiety they had not earned. Daniel stood in the doorway, listening only to my side. "I can send you a list of the items I approved before my access was removed," I said. "Anything outside that list must go through compliance or the independent reviewer. We need more than a list. I cannot advise on work I have not been authorized to control. Some of us could lose our jobs." The words landed with enough force to make me close my eyes. "I know," I said. "That is why I will not create another false approval that leaves all of you exposed later." After the call, Daniel waited. "They want me back," I said. "Do you want to go?" "I want the staff protected." That wasn't my question. My jaw tightened. "If I go back, I can stop mistakes. Under whose authority?" No answer came. He stepped closer but did not touch me. "If you return without authority, whose name sits under the next mistake?" "Mine." It had always been mine. I sent Leah the approved items register and the compliance contact. Nothing more. An hour later, she forwarded a photograph from a rehearsal meeting she had attended. The slide showed a revised circulation drawing. At the bottom right sat an approval stamp carrying my name and registration number. The signature block resembled mine. I enlarged the image. The route revision had been made after the date on my inspection note. The stamp did not appear in my original. Leah's next message arrived, before I could respond. She saw it. "Sophie stopped on that slide and said, 'Good, that should reassure them.' She didn't ask where it came from." The room seemed to narrow around the screen. That did not prove Sophie had inserted it. It proved she had seen it. She knew I had withdrawn authorization. She had also chosen not to ask a question because the answer might make the presentation less useful. The dispute was no longer only about who received credit. A client could interpret the slide as evidence that I had approved a revision affecting passenger access. If the stamp were accepted as genuine, the responsibility could follow my name long after the presentation ended. The night before our wedding, Daniel and I boarded the Ocean Crown with 2 suit carriers, 1 small suitcase, and an archive drive locked inside my handbag. The cabin flowers had already been arranged. A bottle of champagne waited beside 2 glasses. Neither of us opened it. My laptop sat on the desk beneath the round window. The photographed slide filled the screen beside my original drawing. Same project code, different revision, different date. The stamp had been added after my notice. Revision history from the files I possessed established that much. It did not identify the person who inserted it. Guessing would weaken everything else. The supplemental notice stated only what I could prove. The drawing fell outside my approved scope. The stamp had not been issued by me. The file and system logs needed to be preserved for independent review. I sent the notice to Oliver through the portal and forwarded the factual version to Claire. The message left my outbox at 9:12. At 9:17, my father called. I let it go to voicemail. His voice emerged from the speaker without a greeting. "If you walk onto that ship tomorrow after doing this to us, do not come back to this family." The recording ended. 5 seconds later, Mother sent a message. "We are still attending Sophie's preview. At least one of our daughters understands loyalty." The champagne remained unopened. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed. "You could withdraw the notice until after the ceremony," he said carefully. "Yes." "Would that change the evidence?" "No." "Would it change the timing?" "Yes." The project might continue through the preview before the review begins. He looked down at his hands. Do you want to postpone tomorrow? The question opened a door I had not allowed myself to see. We could leave the ship, move the ceremony, tell the guests there had been a professional conflict, wait until the project was resolved. Once again, their choices would become a reduction in my life. No, I said. Daniel lifted his head. We're getting married tomorrow. A knock sounded at the cabin door. Captain Ward stood outside when I opened it. I apologize for disturbing you, she said. Mr. Grant has arranged a compliance meeting for the morning after the ceremony. The ship's schedule means it cannot happen before boarding operations begin. That's fine. There is another matter. I had planned to introduce you by acknowledging your work on the ship. My hand tightened around the door edge. If that would create discomfort, she continued, I can remove it. For years, the solution to other people's discomfort had been to make me smaller. No, I said. Please keep it. Captain Ward gave one brief nod. Then I'll see you on deck. After she left, I placed my phone beside the archive drive. Father's voicemail remained marked unheard, even though I had listened to every word. By 11 the next morning, the flowers were tied to the rail. Daniel stood across from me, and Captain Ward lifted the microphone. Below us, a black VIP shuttle turned toward the private terminal. Behind its glass, my mother looked up and finally saw where I had chosen to stand. My mother's phone hit the floor of the shuttle just as Captain Ward finished saying my name. Through the tinted glass, Margaret bent down as if retrieving it might undo what she had heard. Graham remained upright beside her, one hand braced against the seat in front of him. Sophie turned toward the polished plaque, mounted beside the private gangway. From the upper deck, I could not read their faces clearly enough to claim what any of them felt. What I could see was simpler. They had found the wedding. They had found the ship. And they had heard the captain identify the person responsible for the accessibility work before Sophie's preview had even begun. The shuttle continued along the secured lane. No one got out. No one asked the driver to stop. Daniel's hand waited between us, palm open. For a moment, the harbor seemed louder than the ceremony. Engines idled below. A gull cried above the mast. Somewhere near the terminal, a reversing vehicle gave 3 measured beeps. Captain Ward glanced at me. Shall we continue? Yes, I said. Please. Daniel's fingers closed around mine. The ceremony did not become a confrontation. No one on the deck pointed toward the shuttle. None of our guests jeered or whispered loud enough for me to hear. Captain Ward returned to the vows, and the people who had come to celebrate us turned their attention back where it belonged. Daniel spoke first. His voice wavered on the opening sentence, then steadied. He promised not to mistake protection for control. He promised to ask before stepping in. He promised to build a life with me rather than around me. Those words carried the weight of the previous 6 weeks without dragging the conflict into the center of our wedding. When my turn came, the folded card in my hand felt unnecessary. I spent a long time believing love was proven by how much of myself I could remove, I said. You never asked me to become smaller, so you could feel secure. I promised not to disappear and call it devotion. I promised to stand beside you as myself, even when that is harder than being agreeable. The wind lifted the edge of my veil. Daniel smiled. Captain Ward pronounced us married. Applause rose around us, followed by the ship's horn sounding once across the harbor. That was the sound I remembered later, not my mother's phone striking the floor, not the engine of the departing shuttle, but the horn rolling over the water while Daniel kissed me. For several minutes, there was no contract, no portal, no approval stamp, no Bennett Marine Interiors. There was only the man I had chosen, and the people who had chosen to be present. Aunt Rose found me after the photographs. She approached near the observation lounge, holding her phone in both hands. I'm sorry to bring this to you now, she said, but your mother has already sent something to the group. The message appeared beneath the photograph Margaret had taken through the shuttle window. The image showed the upper decks of the Ocean Crown, though the angle cut off the section where the ceremony had taken place. We had no idea where the wedding was. Imagine finding out this way. Several relatives had responded with sympathy. One had written that no parent should be publicly humiliated. Another asked why I had kept the ship's secret. The old impulse rose at once. Answer every person, explain the security packet, provide the timeline, defend the ceremony until no one could accuse me of causing pain. That impulse had cost me years. May I send you the documents? I asked Rose. She nodded. From the archive folder on my phone, I attached the original invitation, the confirmed response, and the final security email showing that both parents had received the ship name, terminal, and boarding instructions. No speech accompanied them. Only one sentence. They were invited, received the final packet, and chose another event. Rose read it. Do you want me to post this? No. Forward it only if someone asks you directly what you saw. What will you do? The same thing I did with the project records. Keep the original and stop arguing with edited versions. The answer sounded firmer than I felt. Later, inside our cabin, Daniel loosened his tie and poured the champagne we had left unopened the night before. Do you regret keeping the captain's introduction? He asked. No. Do you regret not stopping the shuttle? The question made me look toward the round window. By then, the terminal lights had come on. Passengers moved along the gangway in small groups. Sophie's preview reception was taking place several decks below us. No, I said. They saw enough. Daniel raised his glass. Too enough. The compliance meeting began at 9 the next morning. Oliver had reserved a conference room away from the passenger areas. The windows looked over the container docks rather than the polished marina, and the table held 2 printed document sets with matching project codes. One identified Sophie as design lead. The other identified me as the responsible accessibility architect. Graham sat across from me. Margaret took the chair beside him. Sophie placed her tablet on the table and kept the screen dark. An independent reviewer named Priya Shah joined Oliver at the far end. Nadia appeared by video on a wall monitor. Daniel did not attend. Before I left the cabin, he had asked one question. Do you have everything you decided to bring? Yes. Then I'll be here when you come back. No strategy, no last-minute speech, no attempt to follow. Oliver opened the meeting. This is a project-specific review, he said. It is not a court hearing, and no one here will make findings outside the scope of the vessel approvals. We need to establish which work was authorized, who was responsible for each revision, and whether the current package can proceed. Graham folded his hands. My daughter's notice arose from a private disagreement that should never have reached the client. The word daughter landed before the word professional. Oliver looked toward me. Miss Bennett, do you want to respond? Only with the records. The first file was the original A17 route plan. Metadata showed the creation date, my author account, and the internal review trail. The next document contained the passenger interviews and testing notes. Nadia's name appeared among the participants. Then came the regulatory submission, listing my registration number and scope. The public portfolio followed. Same project. Samroute. Different lead designer. Sophie shifted in her chair when Oliver placed the 2 pages side by side. This is branding, Graham said. The legal responsibility remains with the company. Companies do not hold individual professional registration, Priya replied. People do. He turned toward her. The company owns the work. Ownership and approval are separate questions, she said. The distinction had taken me weeks to force into the conversation. Hearing it stated by someone else did not win the matter for me. It simply cleared the space where the evidence could be heard. I presented the 2 signature pages I had crossed out. The handwritten note remained visible beneath the scan timestamp. Not reviewed. No professional authorization granted. Next came the email confirming my notice. Then the revised drawing. The approval stamp carrying my name appeared in the bottom corner. A copy of my original stood beside it. No stamp. Different revision date. Different route configuration. My office did not issue that approval, I said. Graham looked at the page. You worked on the underlying design. Not on this revision. It was based on your system. That does not make it approved by me. Oliver turned to Sophie. Did you see this slide before the preview presentation? She glanced at her father before answering. I could not know what she was seeking in that glance. Permission, reassurance, a cue. All I knew was that she looked at him before she looked at Oliver. Yes, she said. When? At rehearsal. Did you know your sister had withdrawn authorization? I knew there was a dispute. That was not my question. Her fingers moved along the edge of the tablet. Yes. Did you ask who added the stamp? No. Why not? I assumed the presentation team had cleared it with Graham. Leah's message had described the moment differently. Sophie had stopped at the slide and said it should reassure the client. Both statements could be true. Neither excused using the slide. Oliver asked whether she had instructed anyone to insert the stamp. No. Do you know who did? No. I did not accuse her of doing it. The available record did not support that claim. What it supported was narrower and more damaging to the story she had told herself. She had seen a mark carrying my authority after learning I had withdrawn it. The mark strengthened her presentation. She chose not to question it. Nadia's image remained still on the monitor until Oliver invited her to speak. I can confirm only the meetings I attended, she said. Eleanor led the user interviews, route tests, and technical discussions. Sophie attended some presentation sessions. I never saw Sophie make or approve the accessibility calculations. Graham leaned back. This entire argument is being inflated by terminology. Sophie led the design vision. Eleanor handled implementation. Nadia looked directly into her camera. When a counter blocks my turning path, I do not experience that as terminology. No one added anything for several seconds. Priya asked Sophie to explain 3 decisions attributed to her in the portfolio. Why had the route bypassed the casino floor? What required the revised turning area near the aft restaurant? Which passenger feedback led to the information desk height? Sophie answered the first in broad language about comfort. She could not identify the evacuation consideration connected to the second. On the third, she said the desk had been lowered for visual openness. The interview records showed otherwise. The height had been selected after passengers described difficulty speaking to staff over the original counter. Oliver closed the portfolio. Graham shifted the argument. Whatever disagreements exist over attribution, Bennett Marine Interiors owns employee-created work. Much of the work created in my ordinary duties belongs to the company, I said. His eyes narrowed at the concession. The agreement offering 5% lay inside my folder. I placed it on the table. This document asks me to assign pre-existing frameworks, templates created before project instruction, associated methods, and outside scope concepts retroactively. It also asks me to confirm that all of them were created during ordinary duties. Standard housekeeping, Graham said. Then why does the company require my signature? To remove ambiguity. Exactly. Priya read the relevant clause. The assignment is broader than the work listed in the employment schedule. My father's voice remained even. That is why it was drafted. The sentence did not amount to a confession. It did not need to. The agreement existed because the ownership position was not as absolute as he had repeatedly claimed. More important, even the broadest assignment could not create professional approval for a later revision. Oliver returned to the stamped drawing. If Miss Bennett had already granted authority for this scope, why was a retroactive transfer and continued sign-off agreement presented afterward? Graham answered that the agreement concerned commercial certainty, not professional approval. It was a different explanation from the email claiming company ownership had already resolved the issue. I added both statements to the notes in front of me. No dramatic exposure followed. No one ordered security into the room. Oliver announced that accessibility approval for the 2 new vessels would remain paused. Work unrelated to the disputed scope could continue if separated and independently reviewed. The altered revision would require re-inspection. All logs, source files, and presentation records would be preserved. Graham looked at me. You understand what this delay will cost? Yes. And you are prepared to accept responsibility for that? I accept responsibility for the notice I sent. I do not accept responsibility for work presented under my name without authorization. Oliver asked whether I would cooperate with an orderly handover of valid materials. Yes, I said. With an itemized record, defined scope, and completion date, I will not resume professional responsibility. That decision changed the meeting. Until then, Graham could still present my objection as leverage for a better title or larger share. By offering the lawful files without offering myself. I removed that argument. The company could keep what it properly owned. It could not keep using me. Sophie caught up with me near the terminal cafe. Ellie. The sound of my shortened name made me stop. She had used Eleanor throughout the review, as though formality could place distance between us. Now she stood beneath the departure board, with her tablet pressed to her chest. You humiliated me. No. The documents contradicted the presentation. You knew they would ask me technical questions. You accepted a title that implied you could answer them. I never said I was the responsible architect. The brochure did. That was Mum's wording. You presented it. Her mouth tightened. People moved around us with luggage and coffee cups. Nothing about the setting offered privacy, but neither of us raised our voice. Did you know my registration number was attached to the 2 new vessels? I asked. No. Did you know my name had been removed from the public portfolio? I knew the deck was simplified. Did you see the stamp before the presentation? She looked past me toward the cafe counter. Yes. Did you know I had withdrawn authorization? I knew you had sent something. Why didn't you ask? Dad said the paperwork had been handled. That is not an answer. It was good enough at the time. There it was. Not proof that she had inserted anything. Proof that the answer had been good enough because the result benefited her. You could have asked me, I said. You were trying to stop the pitch. I was trying to stop my approval being used where it did not exist. She shifted the tablet against her chest. Oliver said I need to correct my role. If you tell him I was only creative director, I may be able to stay on the project. I won't tell him what your role was. You know what I did. I know what I saw. You need to state your own role and correct your own claims. Her voice dropped. You could help me. I will confirm what you correct. I will not correct it for you. For years, helping Sophie had meant reaching the finish line twice. Once for myself and once carrying the consequences of her choices. That pattern ended beside a terminal cafe, without an audience from the company, and without applause. She opened her tablet. What should I write? That is part of doing it yourself. Her eyes met mine. Did Dad ever intend to give either of us the company? The question had lived in me for years, but the document supplied only one honest answer. I have no shares, I said. You have no technical authority. He controls the accounts and voting rights. That is what I can prove. Sophie looked down at the screen. Before I left, she drafted an email identifying herself as creative director and presentation lead, not the responsible accessibility architect. She sent it to Oliver while I stood there. No apology accompanied it. I did not ask for one. 6 weeks passed before the audit produced its first formal findings. During that time, Daniel and I returned from our brief honeymoon to a smaller bank balance and a dining table still covered with labeled files. My notice period continued. Salary arrived correctly. The completion bonus did not. Bennett Marine Interiors communicated through formal email rather than calls. Each message addressed me as Miss Bennett, even when Mother had been copied. The broker confirmed that work properly completed during my employment remained subject to the company policy wording, but the disputed revisions needed explicit separation. No special runoff arrangement appeared by magic. Every conversation required dates, project codes, and careful distinctions. The personal reserve account began paying for the choices I had already made. Broker consultations, registration, independent professional advice, preliminary insurance costs, a small accounting retainer. The first independent assignment came from a regional ferry operator asking for a 1-day access review. The fee was modest, the work was mine. No one had introduced me through my father. No one had asked which Bennett daughter would present the findings. A second assignment followed 3 weeks later. The income did not replace my salary. It did prove I could earn beyond the company. The audit report arrived on a gray Thursday morning. Its wording was restrained. The approval stamp had not come from the original file issued by me. It had been added after my notice. The presentation workflow showed that a coordinator had retrieved the stamp image from the company asset library after Graham marked the deck final for client use. No record showed Sophie inserting it. Rehearsal notes and her own statement confirmed that she had seen it and proceeded without asking for verification. The report did not speculate about criminal intent. It did not need to. The client rejected the altered approval and required a new inspection. Part of the accessibility package moved to an independent reviewer. Bennett Marine Interiors kept other portions of the contract but lost a secondary work package when the delay pushed it beyond the available schedule. No single consequence destroyed the company. That made the result more believable and, in some ways, more satisfying. Graham lost exactly what he had treated as inexhaustible: the ability to use my authority without giving me control. Commercial mediation began 3 months after the wedding. The first session dealt with scope, handover, current attribution, and insurance responsibilities because the client needed clarity. The final financial settlement required additional accounting review and was not signed until roughly 6 months after the ceremony. Daniel drove me to the mediation office but did not enter the room. "You know what you will accept?" he asked. "Yes." "And what you won't?" "Yes." He touched my hand once. "Then I'll see you afterward." Inside, each side had an advisor. The mediator explained that she would not decide who had been the better parent, daughter, employer, or sister. Her role was to identify what could be resolved without extended litigation. That limitation suited me. The records were arranged in the same order as my first timeline. Timesheets showed that most technical design hours belonged to me. Internal invoices charged the client for lead accessibility work. Marketing credited Sophie. Compliance records assigned responsibility to me. My employment contract supported company ownership of work created during ordinary duties. The proposed assignment reached beyond that language to include earlier frameworks, outside scope concepts, and associated methods. The audit separated my authorized work from the later revision carrying the stamp. Graham's position required all those documents to mean the same thing. They did not. My requests were narrower than he expected. Accurate attribution for the work performed. Payment for demonstrable work beyond the compensated scope. No future use of my registration, biography, signature block, or approval stamp. A defined handover process. Written confirmation that valid historical work performed during employment would continue to be handled under the company's policy obligations, with cooperation if a claim appeared later. Contribution toward the broker and insurance expenses caused by the disputed use of my credentials. Correction of active portfolios and client materials within a fixed period. The company offered a larger payment if I signed language stating that the previous attribution had not been inaccurate. "No," I said. The advisor beside me pointed out that refusing might reduce the settlement. "I understand." Graham leaned forward. "You claimed this was about money owed to you. It is also about the record. The record can be settled. Facts can be corrected. They cannot be purchased into becoming different facts." The final agreement did not award me the company, the full value of the contracts, or every concept I had ever created. It did something more useful. Bennett Marine Interiors had to stop using my credentials immediately. Existing documents required correction within 90 days. The company acknowledged my role as lead accessibility architect on the relevant work. Sophie's title became creative director and presentation lead. The disputed revision was excluded from my responsibility. Valid historical work remained within the company's policy and cooperation obligations, subject to confirmed wording. A portion of my broker and insurance costs would be reimbursed. Outstanding fees and the settlement would be paid over 24 months rather than in one impossible sum. The payment schedule protected the employees who had not created the problem while preventing Graham from postponing responsibility indefinitely. One clause attempted to restrict communications with insurers and professional bodies. I refused it. No settlement would require me to ignore a reporting obligation. By the time the final document reached the signature page, my hand no longer trembled. Graham signed first. Then the mediator turned the agreement toward me. After adding my name, I closed the pen. He watched me across the table. "You got your name," he said. "Was it worth losing your family?" The question carried the same old bargain. Belonging in exchange for surrender. I looked at my signature. "I lost the role you gave me," I said. "That is not the same thing." Margaret arrived at our house 4 days later with the wedding album tucked beneath one arm. She had not called. Through the glass panel beside the door, I watched her adjust the album against her coat before ringing a second time. Daniel remained in the kitchen. He did not come to the hallway until I asked. I opened the door, but did not step aside. Mother held out the album. "I thought you should have this. Thank you." The cover was pale blue, the color she had once asked whether she was allowed to wear. She kept one hand on it after I took the weight. "I don't want this to continue forever," she said. "What does this mean?" "The distance, the formal messages, having to hear news about you from other people. You told other people I excluded you from my wedding. We all said things under pressure. I sent documents. You always have documents." The sentence might once have made me feel ashamed of being exact. Now it sounded like an admission that facts had become inconvenient. "Yes," I said. "That is why the story did not remain yours." Her hand fell away from the album. "Can we begin again? Not by skipping the part where you correct what you said." I corrected the company pages, because the agreement required it. Her chin lifted. "What else do you expect? The same group received the message that you didn't know where the wedding was and had been made unwelcome. Send them a correction." Her expression tightened. "You want me to humiliate myself?" "No. State what happened. You both confirmed attendance. You received the security packet. You chose the preview and did not open the attachment. That makes us sound careless. It describes the choice." She looked toward the kitchen, perhaps expecting Daniel to appear. He did not. "And after that?" she asked. "After that, contact remains limited. No arriving without notice. No speaking for me. No messages through relatives. No involvement in my work. I am your mother. You are being asked to respect the conditions for entering my home." A car passed behind her on the street. For several seconds, she held my gaze. "I need time." "Take it." The answer surprised her enough that she blinked. My old self would have softened the condition immediately. Offered tea. Explained that I still loved her. Reduced the boundary until she could cross it without changing. Instead, the doorway remained between us. She left without coming inside. 3 days later, the correction appeared in the extended relative group. Graham and I were invited to Eleanor and Daniel's wedding and had confirmed our places. The final security information was sent to us. We had already chosen to attend Sophie's industry preview and did not review the attachment before the date. Eleanor did not exclude us. 2 relatives apologized directly. 3 said nothing. 1 wrote that I should now forgive everything because Mother had done what I asked. I did not answer. A correction was not reconciliation. It was the first action required before reconciliation could even be considered. 9 months after the wedding, I unlocked the door to Clear Passage Marine Access at 7:30 on a Monday morning. The studio occupied 2 rooms above a chandlery near the harbor. 3 desks faced windows streaked with salt. The meeting room was hired by the hour from the business center downstairs. Nothing matched. 1 chair was blue, 1 gray, 1 borrowed from Daniel's study until the replacement arrived. The company existed because I had prepared before leaving Bennett Marine Interiors. Savings carried the first months. 2 small contracts paid the basic bills. My reserve funded professional insurance, registration, accounting, and the broker work required to protect the boundary between my old employment and new practice. The settlement had not created the studio. It arrived after the studio had already survived long enough to send its 4th invoice. Leah joined after applying through the same process as everyone else. She had resigned from Bennett Marine Interiors without asking me to recruit her. Nadia worked as a paid project advisor, reviewing user testing plans and refusing any meeting scheduled before 9. Daniel continued teaching. No one rich appeared to rescue the accounts. Some months remained uncomfortably close. The first settlement payment arrived during the week my second insurance installment was due. Part of it replenished the reserve I had already spent. Part went into the pension I had delayed. The remainder gave the studio 3 months of operating space instead of 1. That afternoon, Daniel and I returned to the Ocean Crown. Captain Ward met us near the gangway and led us toward the revised wayfinding plaque. Nadia and Leah were already waiting. The plaque did not place my name above everyone else. It simply placed it where it belonged. Accessibility Design Lead, Eleanor Bennett. Below it were the names of the research, engineering, installation, and testing contributors. Nadia read the list. Better, she said. Accurate, I replied. Captain Ward held up a phone. Would you like a photograph? For years, publicity photographs had placed me at the edge, while Sophie stood nearest my father. This time, I did not stand alone beside the plaque, as if recognition were a private prize. I asked Nadia and Leah to join me. Daniel stood behind Captain Ward, smiling but not entering the frame until I waved him over. Just before the photograph, my phone vibrated. An unfamiliar number appeared. The voicemail preview displayed 2 words: Graham Bennett. No emergency message followed. No professional reason for contact. Only his name, waiting for me to resume the role he understood. I blocked the number. Then I returned the phone to my bag and stood beside the plaque. Captain Ward counted down. The shutter clicked. Beyond the windows, Southampton drifted away as the ship began to leave the berth. For years, I had waited for my relatives to say my name, as if that would make me real. In the end, I did not need them to say it. I needed to stop letting them erase it.